He pointed at her like she was something he'd stepped in. "Get her out of my sight," said Clifton Aldridge, loud enough that the string quartet paused, just for a half beat, before continuing their Vivaldi. "I said, get her out now." The woman he was pointing at stood very still. She was holding a tray of champagne flutes, and not a single one trembled. Her name was Dr. Odessa Beaumont Price, and she had been under cover for 11 weeks, 2 days, and, she would later note in her incident report, approximately 4 hours. She did not move. The banquet hall at the Harrington Grand was the kind of room that made you feel poor just by looking at it. 14-foot ceilings, gold leaf crown molding, flowers flown in from somewhere that wasn't here. 300 guests in black tie, all of them donors to the Aldridge Children's Wellness Foundation, a charity that had, over the past 6 years, raised $47 million for pediatric health care in underserved communities, and distributed, according to the forensic accountants, approximately 9% of it. But nobody in this room knew that. That was the point. What they knew was that Clifton Aldridge was furious. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had played football in college and had spent the 30 years since reminding people about it. He chaired the board of 3 hospitals, sat on the governor's advisory council on public health, and had been photographed shaking hands with enough important people that the photographs had their own dedicated hallway in the foundation's headquarters. And right now, he was pointing at the black woman with the champagne tray and demanding she be removed from his gala. "She looked at me," he said, to no one in particular, though the cluster of men around him, all of them donor tier, all of them careful, shuffled and looked at their shoes. These people, they don't know how to. He stopped himself. Not out of decency, out of an audience calculation. Just get the catering manager. Odessa watched him without expression. She had been watching Clifton Aldridge for 11 weeks, and she had learned that he performed differently depending on who was in the room. With donors, he was magnanimous, expansive, the kind of man who laughed too loud at his own generosity. With staff, he was a different animal entirely. She had seen him reduce a 23-year-old events coordinator to tears over the placement of a flower arrangement. She had seen him dock pay from a parking attendant for getting mud on his car door during a rainstorm. She had seen him, 3 weeks ago at a foundation board meeting, refer to the communities his charity supposedly served as those people, and watch as the room full of lawyers and executives did absolutely nothing. So being pointed at like something he'd stepped in was, honestly, not the worst thing she'd encountered since January. The catering manager materialized. His name was Felipe, and he had the look of a man who had learned, through painful experience, that the customer was always right, even when the customer was a sociopath. "I'm sorry, Mr. Aldridge, is there a problem?" "That woman," Clifton said, without looking at Odessa directly anymore, as if she had already ceased to exist. "She made eye contact with me. Multiple times. I don't pay your company to send me people who stare." Philippe opened and closed his mouth. "I don't want to see her again tonight," Clifton said. "Put her in the kitchen, or send her home. I don't care which." He turned back to his cluster of donors and smiled. That broad, easy smile that had launched 1,000 fundraising campaigns, and the moment passed. For him, it had already passed. Felipe turned to Odessa with a look that was equal parts apology and self-preservation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to." "Of course," Odessa said. Her voice was even, calm. The voice of a woman who had testified before the Senate Finance Committee and hadn't raised it once, even when the senator from Ohio had interrupted her for the 5th time. She carried the champagne tray to a side table, set it down carefully, and walked toward the service corridor. Nobody watched her go. That was, she reflected, one of the genuinely useful things about being underestimated. People stopped watching you the moment they thought you were handled. She stepped into the corridor and let the door swing shut behind her. The noise of the gala dropped to a murmur. She stood there for a moment in the fluorescent hum of the service hallway, next to a cart of folded linens and a stack of rinsed wine glasses. Then she took out her phone and sent a single text to the number listed as Aunt Marley's in her contacts. The text said, "He's in the East Wing. I need 20 minutes. The reply came in 11 seconds. "You've got it. What the guests at the Harrington Grand did not know, what Clifton Aldrich did not know, what Felipe the catering manager did not know, was that Dr. Odessa Beaumont Price was not, in fact, a catering server. She was the senior director of the Healthcare Fraud Division of the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. She had a law degree from Georgetown and a doctorate in health policy from Johns Hopkins. She had spent 22 years investigating the fraudulent diversion of federal healthcare funds, and she had a conviction rate that her supervisor still occasionally mentioned at departmental retreats, with the specific tone of a person showing off a trophy they didn't entirely deserve credit for. She was 54 years old, and she had been doing this long enough to know that some investigations required paperwork, and some required patience, and some, the ones that kept her in the job, required you to put on a white catering uniform and spend 11 weeks watching a man smile for cameras while children's medical grants were funneled into offshore shell companies. The Aldrich Foundation case had begun 18 months earlier with a whistleblower, a junior accountant named Geneva who had noticed during a routine budget reconciliation that the numbers did not add up, not slightly, not within normal variance. They did not add up by a margin that made her feel, she had told Odessa during their first meeting, physically sick. 47 million raised. 4.2 million actually disbursed. The rest, routed through a cascade of LLCs, consulting firms, and a particularly elegant arrangement involving a Cayman Islands trust, had ended up financing, among other things, Clifton Aldrich's vacation compound in the Florida Keys, a custom sailing yacht, and the private education of his 4 grandchildren. The problem, as it always was in these cases, was evidence. They had Geneva's testimony. They had the accounting irregularities. What they did not have was the mechanism, the specific chain of transactions, the specific authorizations, the specific documents that would make this case airtight enough that a defense attorney couldn't spend 3 weeks confusing a jury about nonprofit accounting practices. What they needed was the CFO. His name was Prescott Ludlow, and he was, by all external measures, a model of charitable sector professionalism. He had been with the foundation for 8 years. He had co-authored 2 white papers on nonprofit financial governance. He was photographed regularly at conference panels about ethical stewardship of donor funds. He was also, based on every piece of evidence the team had assembled, the architect of the entire scheme. But Prescott Ludlow was careful. He did not discuss foundation finances at board meetings. He did not send incriminating emails. He used a specific phrase, "Let's take this offline," whenever any conversation moved toward specifics, and then the conversation moved to a location with no recording, no witnesses, no paper trail. Odessa had read the surveillance reports so many times she had memorized the phrase, "Let's take this offline." What Prescott Ludlow had not accounted for was a woman with a champagne tray and 11 weeks of patience. Because in those 11 weeks, working catering shifts at foundation events, board dinners, donor receptions, always background, always unremarkable, always the person Clifton Aldrich waved away without looking at. Odessa had watched. She had learned the rhythms of the foundation's social calendar. She had identified the specific events where Aldrich and Ludlow moved from the public space to the private dining room on the East Wing's 2nd floor. She had also, 3 weeks ago, arranged for a particular piece of equipment to be installed in that dining room during a scheduled HVAC maintenance call. She had 20 minutes. She used 12 of them. When she came back through the service corridor and emerged on the other side of the ballroom floor, the gala was in full swing. The auction had started. A weekend in Tuscany went for $18,000 to a man who was already laughing at something before the gavel came down. Odessa positioned herself near the East Wing corridor. Invisible. A woman with a tray, waiting. She heard Clifton Aldrich before she saw him. That laugh, broad, performed, filling whatever room it entered. He was coming through the East Corridor with Prescott Ludlow and 2 other men she recognized from Foundation Board records. They walked past her without looking at her. She followed at a distance that would have looked, to anyone watching, like she was heading toward the kitchen. She had been doing this for 22 years. She knew how to look like she was heading toward the kitchen. At 9:47 p.m., in the private dining room on the second floor of the east wing of the Harrington Grand Hotel, Clifton Aldridge said, with the ease of a man entirely confident in his privacy, "The Q3 transfer clears on Thursday. Prescott, I need you to have the Cayman documentation processed before the board meeting." Prescott Ludlow said, "Already done." At 9:48 p.m., Odessa sent a second text to the number saved as Aunt Marlis. This one said, "Now, the next 15 minutes happened quickly, and she would not remember them later in the cinematic, slow-motion way that people sometimes described significant moments. She remembered them the way she always remembered moments like this, in fragments, precise and detail-specific, the weight of her credentials in her jacket pocket, the sound of footsteps in the corridor. The expression on Prescott Ludlow's face when the door opened, not surprise, not yet, but a particular quality of stillness, the stillness of a man whose brain has not yet caught up with what his body already knows." Clifton Aldridge turned around, and Odessa Beaumont Price showed him her badge. She said not loudly, not with satisfaction, in the same even voice she'd used with Felipe, the catering manager, "Mr. Aldridge, I'm Senior Director Beaumont Price, with the HHS Office of Inspector General. You're under arrest for federal healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to misappropriate charitable funds." Clifton Aldridge looked at her. He looked at the badge. He looked at the 4 federal agents who had come through the door behind her. He looked back at her. And in that moment, in the specific private collapse of that moment, Odessa watched something happen to Clifton Aldridge's face that she had seen before, had seen many times before, but which never quite lost its quality of instruction. The confidence didn't leave all at once. It left in stages, like a building losing power floor by floor. He said, "I don't. You're the—" He stopped. "The woman you had removed from your event floor," Odessa said. "Yes." Behind her, she heard one of the agents begin to read. She stopped listening to the words because she had heard them many times. She was watching Prescott Ludlow, who had gone very quiet and very pale, and who was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating something. That expression, she knew from experience, was the beginning of cooperation. She was not wrong. By 11:30 that evening, Prescott Ludlow had indicated, through his attorney, who arrived in 45 minutes, which suggested he'd been on standby, that he wished to discuss the terms of a cooperation agreement. Downstairs, the auction continued. Someone bought a private dinner with a celebrity chef for $22,000. The string quartet played. The flowers from Somewhere Expensive held their arrangement. In the service corridor, Felipe, the catering manager, was briefing his staff on the change in the evening's circumstances with the shell-shocked calm of a man who had managed events for 15 years and thought he had seen everything. Odessa sat in a temporary command post they had set up in a hotel conference room and went through the initial documentation with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She had changed out of the catering uniform. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and the expression of a woman who had work to do and intended to do it. At 12:17 a.m., one of the junior agents, she thought his name was Tanner, though she was not entirely certain, brought her a cup of coffee without being asked. She looked up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, with the specific quality of deference that new agents occasionally displayed around her, not performative, not sycophantic, but genuine, the recognition of someone watching a professional in their element. She drank the coffee and went back to the documentation. There was, she knew, a version of this moment that other people romanticized. The reveal, the badge, the expression on the villain's face. She understood the appeal. She genuinely did. There was a reason people liked those stories, a reason the moment Clifton Aldridge's certainty had drained out of his face would stay in the back of her mind for a long time. But the moment she actually cared about, the one she would think about on the drive home, in the particular stillness of a highway at 1 a.m., was a different one. It was a woman named Geneva, 26 years old, junior accountant, who had sat across from Odessa 18 months ago in a conference room in Washington, D.C., and said, "I know it probably seems small, but the money was supposed to go to kids who needed medical care. And it didn't, And I couldn't just, she had stopped, started again. I couldn't just look at the numbers and pretend I wasn't seeing them. Odessa had thought about Geneva every week of those 11 weeks, when Clifton Aldridge had waved her away, when she had stood in fluorescent-lit service corridors, when Felipe had turned to her with his apology and self-preservation expression. She had thought, the numbers don't lie. Someone has to look at them. She had been looking for 22 years. She pulled onto the highway at 1:08 a.m. The city was behind her, and the road ahead was dark and empty and very quiet. She drove with the windows down because the night air was still warm, the particular warmth of late spring, the kind of evening that reminded her, obliquely, of why she'd gone to law school in the first place. Something she'd read in a brief, years ago, about what justice was supposed to mean in practice and not just in principle. Her phone buzzed. She didn't pick it up. She never picked it up while driving, a rule she maintained with the same consistency she brought to documentation standards. But she saw, in the brief illumination of the screen, that it was a message from her supervisor. She would read it when she got home. She already knew what it said. She knew because she had been doing this for 22 years, and she knew the shape of a case when it closed, and this one had closed cleanly. The documentation would hold. The cooperation agreement would accelerate the asset recovery. The Foundation's legitimate programs, the few that existed, would be transferred to proper oversight, and somewhere, eventually, the money that had been promised to children who needed medical care would get closer to actually reaching them. That was not a satisfying ending in the way that stories liked to be satisfying. It wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a badge flash. It was paperwork and court dates and a process that would take another 18 months and involve a great many people in conference rooms. But it was the thing underneath the thing, the reason the badge mattered. Odessa Beaumont Price drove home through the warm spring night, and she thought about Geneva, and she thought about the numbers, and she thought about the Children's Hospital in Detroit that had been waiting 3 years for a grant that had quietly, elegantly disappeared into a sailing yacht and a vacation compound in the Florida Keys. She turned off the highway. She rolled up the windows. She thought, we got him. And then she went home, because there was another case file on her desk, and it was not going to read itself.